Okay, so today we are looking at academic writing part 2. So thinking kind of what we did last week, but building off of that into how to practically put our ideas to paper in whatever type of writing we're trying to do. So particularly, we want to then think about how do we move from our thesis to an argument. So there are 3 big questions that should be asked in this transition. The first is, what do I have to prove? The second, how will I prove it? The third, is the connection clear? So again, we have a thesis, we have something we're trying to say. As we talked about last week, there's one theme throughout the writing, one streamlined argument. One streamlined point. Now we have to take that and make it an argument. We have to convince the reader, convince the professor, convince whoever to believe, to buy into our thesis. So we have to support it or prove it, figuring out what we have to prove, which is not only the hardest part, figuring then out how will we prove it, what resources will we use to back it up, and then to come back in revision and make sure the connection is clear, like we talked about last week, to make sure the logic flows. So what I want you to do today is to think about, I want this to be somewhat, practical for you. So I want you to think about something you have to write in the coming days, or something you're already writing that you have to turn in the coming days. Whatever the assignment is, think about that assignment in mind and go ahead and try to identify what a thesis might be for that assignment. So again, we're thinking about what is the claim we're trying to make. You should see in parentheses, what are the grounds we're going to use to make it? What warrants the claim? What makes it justifiable? So take a minute or two and think about what thesis you want to try to work with. Good morning. And this can be for any upcoming paper or for a final paper. But what's the thesis? What are you going to try to do? To help you out a little bit, for the claim, it's starting with what do you think? If you're making an argument for a Hebrew Bible class and you're writing a paper, what do you think about it? What is it that you're trying to articulate? When we move to grounds, then it's where we're thinking about how we're going to back that up. Why do you think that? And how do you know it's true? Where's the evidence for that? And there's a distinction there. The reasons, a distinction between the reasons and the evidence. Reasons is, why do you think that? What implication do you think there is for this? Or what does it matter that this argument needs to be made? And then the second part then is, how do you know that it's true? What evidence can you use to back that up? What resources can you rely upon to translate into a clear argument? And then lastly, with our warrant, how do the reasons and the evidence, so both parts of that, support your claim? So if we're making a claim, if we're putting out some argument, how are we substantially supporting it so that it's warranted, so that it's justified, so that the reader gets what we think, but they also get how we think it? Does that make sense? Oftentimes in papers, there's one or the other. We have a very strong argument. We think something really good and it really should be said, but we don't use sufficient evidence to back it up. So even though it should be convincing, the reader is not convinced because we have not given them evidence enough to convince them. Or on the other side, we have a lot of evidence, right? Some people write these papers that way, where they just gather a lot of sources and they just cite a lot of sources, but they're not saying anything. There's no clear argument. There's no clear thesis of what the claim is. So both of those have to be there. One clear claim, evidence and reasons to back it up, so that the reader understands and is justified in whatever it is you're trying to argue. An example: you better put your coat on 40 degrees outside, right? We have a claim. You need to wear a coat. We have grounds. It's 40 degrees outside. What's the evidence for that? The thermostat. What's the warrant? Why should it matter? when it's cold, people should dress warmly. So any part of the other statement could be said by itself. You need to put your coat on, but there's no warrant, right? There's nothing saying why, because it's 40 degrees. On the flip side, you see what happens when people cite a lot, but don't actually have a point. Someone walks up to the thermostat and says, it's 40 degrees outside. And you look at them and say, okay, what am I supposed to do about that, right? Does this make sense? So starting with the claim, whatever this thesis you have, here are some things that it should be. Number one, it should be contestable, which means if it is just fact, and there's no way to argue anything about it, then there's probably not a reason to write a paper about it, right? We can all say the thermostat reads 40 degrees, and that's just a fact. Saying or arguing that people should wear a coat because it is 40 degrees could be contestable, right? There could be different sides of the argument. So it has to be contestable. There has to be something you have to prove, some argument you're trying to make. It needs to be reasonable, of course, because otherwise you're not going to have evidence to support it. And if it's not reasonable, we probably should query why we're writing it. I like to include that it needs to be specific. You, one person, should wear a coat because it is 40 degrees outside. There's not ambiguity. There's not any type of lack of clarity. It is specific. There's one thing being argued. And we talked about this last week, where when there are too many things going on, then it's hard for the reader to know what to walk away with. There has to be some specificity and clarity. For most of the work that we're doing here in theological education, it needs to be significant, right? There is normally some greater or larger theological question involved. Even if the paper itself is historical, even if it's homiletical, et cetera, we're pointing to something else. It matters on a greater scale. And it should be interpretive, not descriptive. By that, I mean, particularly with, I'm thinking about, the Hebrew Bible exam, right? You can offer a description, a recollection of a certain passage from the Hebrew Bible. But again, that's not necessarily a paper. That's not contestable. It's the interpretation. It's what we're doing with it, how we're engaging the scripture that needs to be involved. But we can all just recount what Genesis 1 says, but a paper is going to go the next step further and talk about why it matters. How are we interpreting or engaging it? Questions so far? When it comes to grounds, then, this is where we get into something that is reasonable, because we need reasoning, right? Why do you make your claim? This reasoning, this ground should be connected to this question, and it must be relevant to the claim. If I say you should wear a coat outside, and then I make a comment about how the inside thermostat sex is 68, then those aren't relevant. You're telling me I'm going outside, so I need to wear a coat. So the warrant or the ground for that needs to be about what's happening outside. A lot of times this gets muddled in writing because everyone here is smart. They know a lot of things. They try to throw everything they know into one paper. And then they put in all this stuff into a paper that has nothing to do with their argument. It has to be relevant to the claim. And something I say to people in revision while they are revising, which I think is really important, is even if you do have a lot to say and you're writing a lot, even if something does not belong in this one paper, that does not mean to completely get rid of it. Copy and paste it, put it into a separate Word document where you just house your random pieces of writing, because it might be useful another day in another paper, in another post, etc. But just because it's not relevant for that paper doesn't mean it's not good thinking. It just may not be relevant to the claim you're making here. Thirdly, it needs to be internal, but supported by external evidence. By that, I mean the argument you're making has to be relevant to whatever you're talking about. It needs to be internal to your claim, relevant, but you use external resources, right? You draw upon other scholars, other thinkers who are talking about the same thing or similar things. and use those as reasoning, as evidence. And it's important to remember that this is your voice, your path through the resources. So if you're trying to convince someone of something in an argument, sometimes it's helpful to take a step back and think, how would I be convinced of this argument? What logic would I need to hear? What pieces are missing for me that would make this argument fully convincing? Whereas right now I'm only half convinced. You kind of have to weave your way through the resources so you get to the place of the next one, which is the evidence, right? So you have your reasoning, you have whatever you're trying to prove and why you're making your claim, but you need accurate and sufficient evidence, period, right? This is an academic program. We have to turn in academic papers that require academic evidence. And the evidence needs to be, this often doesn't need to be said to Candler students, but it needs to be representative and authoritative, meaning somebody cannot cite, well, you can. It is unwise to cite Joe Mo at the coffee shop down the street on a biblical assignment about exegesis, right? We have to cite people who do exegetical work. We have to cite someone who has the authority, has the experience, is in the field that we're trying to talk about. Otherwise, anybody can say anything and we can cite them and put them in a paper. But it's not going to be evidence if the facts that we're trying to use aren't gleaned from our research, which should be then gleaned from the people's research that we're citing. If people are just out here making claims, doesn't mean they should be cited. It doesn't count as evidence. Questions? So let's pause here and think about whatever assignment you have in mind, whatever paper that is, and try to articulate what, number one, the claim is, and then move through step two. What are the grounds? So that could be your reasoning or your evidence. And you can type that out, you can talk it out, however you want to process it. But let's try to put this onto something that we have to turn in soon. How do you feel about what you're writing? Right. Well, I mean, yeah, even if it's not something that you're going to turn in, tomorrow, it is. Feel good about where you're at? Want to talk through it? Want to move on? How do you feel? Mm-hmm. I think so. Yeah. And I think it's important always, in the academy, we say citing is important because it's paying respect to whose idea it was, right? So I think it's the true with blog posts or even, people do it on social media. Just, it didn't have to be a footnote, but as so and so says, or as so and so leads me to think X, Y, Z. Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense. And it also helps them to know, like we talked about last week, we write to join a conversation. And so it helps them to know that we're not the only ones thinking about this or writing about it. And we have a certain perspective about it, and we are writing it, from our perspective, but that there are other people who are writing and who also have a different perspective. And if they want, check out these other people because we're all in conversation together. The final one is the warrant, which is making sure that there is a clear connection. So you can state a general principle of reasoning, appropriately limited, clarifies your reason and evidence in your claim, and is persuasive for your readers. The simplest format for this is when then. So a commonly held principle, when it is cold, you should dress warmly. Or even a claim to authority, when we drive without a license, we commit a misdemeanor. So it's a little bit different than cause and effect, but it is a way of, a simple principle, as I said, of reasoning, right? Something that says, when this happens, then this will happen. This is just reasoning. It is common sense in some ways. And for some of these things that to us seem common sense may require an argument or an explanation to be made for our readers. So, I'm thinking here even about the text you brought up last week. When we read this text of terror from the book of Judges, we are led with XYZ conclusions, right? And that's kind of a natural progression. It seems reasonable. So then now we have to interrogate what happens in the reading of it and what happens in the interpretation. But the simplest format is when this exists, then this will exist. What we have to do when we're revising is to make sure that both of the parts of our argument, if we're thinking about a when-then, that both are present and that both are clear. So again, if we're saying when it's cold, you should dress warmly, we have to make sure that it's justified that it is cold, right? That has to be true. And we have to make a successful argument about why then we should dress warmly. Why, when it's cold, can we not dress in shorts, right? So we still have to make sure that both parts of the argument are present and justified, even if it is something that is, to us, commonly held. So let's analyze this argument. I'll read it, and then we'll think through what argument's being made. There are possible roots in the Jewish tradition for speaking in tongues. In at least the older manifestations of Israelite prophecy, we find a combination of inspiration by God's Spirit, trance-like states with the physical signs of dissociation, and the uttering of inarticulate cries. However, given that much of the church in Corinth was most likely Gentile, it seems more likely that the ancient Hebrew connection was at most an afterthought. What do you think here is the argument? What's the claim being made? Almost the opposite, right? There are roots that they're speaking tongues in the Jewish community, but in that last sentence, right? But those in Corinth were mostly more likely Gentiles, so they may not have been speaking in tongues, right? So they're responding. They're engaging in this conversation of in the church of Corinth, who is speaking in tongues. Well, yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. According to this author, right? What this author, though, is talking about, and he does not negate it, though. That's the thing, right? What we see in the quote and the beginning is the evidence. So what their author is saying is there are roots, there are roots in the Jewish tradition for speaking in tongues. And then he cites that. But then we get, however, given that much of the church in Corinth, that's our context, the church in Corinth was most likely Gentile, it seems that this Hebrew connection was probably an afterthought. So that last sentence really situates us in what his argument is. Were people speaking in tongues or not in Corinth, right? So we're talking in the New Testament at this point. And he's saying, yeah, people have been speaking in tongues even from the Jewish traditions, but the people in Corinth were Gentiles. They weren't Jewish. So if they were speaking in tongues, it may not be because of the Jewish tradition, right? It would be because of whatever move of the Spirit is happening among these Gentiles. Does that make sense? So we have a claim, given that much of this last sentence to me is the claim, given that, yes. Well, this is an excerpt, so we're reading kind of, this is only 3 sentences here, really 2 sentences technically. But it also, the last sentence doesn't always, the first sentence is normally the claim if we're in an introduction paragraph, right? But as we're working our way through a paper, this is what we talked about last week in terms of whether the logic flows, it was important for them to establish that speaking in tongues is something a part of the Jewish tradition, in order to then contrast that to say, but the people in Corinth were Gentiles. So if they were speaking in tongues, it may not be connected, right? This ancient Hebrew connection was an afterthought. But in this argument, we have a claim, we have evidence, and we have a warrant, right? Why does it matter? The question they're interrogating is not necessarily whether or not the people in Corinth were speaking in tongues. They're not talking about that. They're questioning whether that was something that emerged in the moment or whether it was connected to these roots in the Jewish tradition. And then they're saying, well, the people were Gentiles, so it couldn't be as connected to the Jewish tradition as we might want to think. Let's do another one. The question the city shaken by Jesus's entry is asking is the same question that Matthew has been answering in the entire pericope. Who is this? This is Jesus, the Messiah that has been promised in the scripture. This is the one who has come to save the people. This is the king that has come to bring glory to Israel. By using references to Jewish literature, the author of Matthew communicates to his audience the messianic identity of Jesus as presented in the triumphal entry. What do you think is the claim here? Right? This example is not as good as the first one to me in terms of the writing. Right? It's very choppy. This is Jesus. This is the one. This is the king. Right? The writing doesn't flow as well. And even the first sentence, the question the city shaken by Jesus's entry is asking, right? That is a very confusing way of articulating or introducing a claim. The question the city shaken by Jesus's entry is asking is the same. It's parts of speech are not in an easy order. But we do see a claim, right, that Jesus is Messiah. Where is there any evidence here? Right, but he didn't give any. Right. By using references to Jewish literature, right? This is what this actually reads like is a very common Candler paper. No, I mean, because students often don't think they have to back things up. Because remember the when then, right? It seems commonplace to us, right? And depending upon what religious tradition we emerge out of, it seems like a given. But that's not true for everybody, or even every religious tradition, or even particularly every Christian tradition. Well, yeah, they're saying that the Gospel of Matthew communicates this. Communicates that Jesus is Messiah. That's correct, right? It'd be what would have strengthened this argument? Yeah. We could have said, as right, or as Isaiah says about the suffering servant, or whatever kind of drawing upon of the Hebrew text would have helped. What we get instead is a nod. By using references to Jewish literature, Matthew communicates to his audience, and we get a leap, I would argue, because we get this idea of the Messiah, the king who comes to save the people, the king who comes to bring glory to Israel, and then we get a leap all the way to the triumphal entry, which is the week of the crucifixion, right? So this is someone who's trying to pose that Jesus is Lord and Jesus is as predicted, but there's not strong evidence. And more importantly, do we get a warrant here? Why does it matter? We don't get anything of why this is important, except for the fact of, I guess, being right. But why would it matter, particularly to the audience here, that Matthew communicates Jesus as being predicted through the Hebrew text, or connecting Jesus' arrival to Jewish literature? What does that do, if anything? So we've taken arguments like this and compare it with the previous one, right? There's a claim, there's a warrant, there's evidence. Here, we get good speech, someone's writing well, but we don't have the claims, we don't have it backed up in the way that it needs to be. This is where it's important to outline. I said last week, I encourage people to write the introduction last rather than first. And I still think that you can do that, and it's true. But you don't need to write or go through the body of your paper without knowing where you are going. It's like leaving your home and getting in the car and just driving, right? There has to be some destination in mind, and we need some type of GPS, some type of directions to get us to the next step. And the reader can feel it. When we're reading something that we see has no direction, we feel lost because the writer is lost and they're just meandering their way through what they want to say, meandering through their sources, and there's not a set argument that we can follow. There's not a logical flow. So it's important to outline, to think ahead of what you're going to say, and how you're going to say it. And it doesn't need to be complex. It doesn't have to be every single thing you're going to say all highlighted and color coded, anything like that. You just need to ask the big questions. Where am I starting? Where am I going? What are 2 or 3 steps I need to get there? And so this connects to the very beginning, right? What is my claim? Where am I starting? What question am I trying to address? How am I going to present this? Where am I going? So in some ways, starting with where my introduction might be, and then ending with my conclusion. At the end of this, what is it that I want to convince people of? What is it that I hope people will understand, or that will my argument will be made clear by the end? And similar to a GPS, I'm starting at this destination. I'm trying to get to that destination. Now I have to say, how do I get there? What are the important sections? What are the important logical moves? What are the important pieces of the argument that have to be present for me to get from here to there? And more importantly, for my reader to get from here to there. That by the end, I have given them a structure, I have given them a flow of argument, that they get to the place I want them to conclude. Does this make sense? And in these kind of outlines, you can still add information or add kind of more thorough. I want to make sure to cite so-and-so in this section, or I need to make sure to reference this previous author here. I want to put this anecdote here, right? You can still kind of beef it up a little, but the broad thing is, where am I starting? Where am I going? How do I get there? The best tip, this is an exercise I'm not going to do. The best tip is to write in sections. So on the previous slide where it said, what are the 2 or 3 sections I need to get there? It is helpful to think in sections. What are the big leaps that are made here? And then within each of those sections, you can write out and handle all the minutia, right? All the smaller pieces of that argument. But if I'm making, it's like, a 3-point sermon. If I'm trying to get to one place, there are 3 big pieces. The smaller pieces I'll deal with within each big section, but I need to be able to think through what are my big sections that the paper is going to have. Then you can convert that outline to topic sentences. There's another way I teach. I was doing a workshop for MTS students and talked about what's called a paragraph synthesis, where you take each paragraph and you write one sentence about what this paragraph is doing, right? If you're summing up this paragraph in one sentence, what is that sentence? Because when you're converting this outline to topic sentences, you should be able to read through those sentences and get the paper, right? Even you have the full paper, every paragraph, you should be able to say this section does this, which connects to this section, which does this, which connects to this section, which says this, and then there's the conclusion of my argument. And you should be able to see through these sentences, okay, every piece of the argument is here. If that is not true in these sentences, then it won't be true in the paper. And sometimes it helps to look at the topic sentences and say, oh, I actually need to add a whole nother section. There's something missing in my logical flow in order to make this argument as convincing as it needs to be. And these topic sentences are both for your benefit and your reader. If you write the whole paper and then you step back to look at the topic sentences, you will be able to tell, even as a reader, whether it makes sense and whether all the points you're making are present. So for instance, we have this passage here from A Radical Jew, the Spirit and Flesh chapter. What we get though in this, if you look at the beginning of the second paragraph, is a topic sentence, right? Somewhere we're going. There are accordingly a significant number of passages which kata oraga is hardly to be understood as an axiological or evaluative sense as a term of opprobrium. I suggest that it's not necessary at all to regard right? We get a statement saying this is where I'm shifting here. I'm analyzing this now. It's within the larger paper, but I have a roadmap. I know where I'm going, and I want the reader to know where I'm going. It's very different, yeah. Because remember, like I said last week, we have the investments in our writing. And saying one would suggest would make it seem like this is some impartial thing. And sometimes you might be writing something that is impartial or trying to write something that's more open for others to consider. That's not what he's doing here. He is saying, no, I am suggesting, right? I'm making the argument based upon my research that this is not necessary, right? We get another one here. In studying passages in Paul's writing in which, according to the flesh, is served as a hermeneutical term, we get the first person plural. We can see the intimate connection between hermeneutics and cultural critique in his thought. Right? There are roadmaps, signposts for where the author is going, and so the reader can catch along. And to respond to your question, there's no reason to not use first person. Look even here, and this is a great example where it's going to be used, right? Paul here is appealing to the Corinthians to consider the verse practice in literal sense, Consider the practice of Israel, which is what Paul means. I thus disagree with Richard Hayes' implied interpretation, right? It's not one might disagree with his interpretation. No, I disagree with it. And I'm offering something else, right? I'm making an argument here, and I'm putting that, at least in this section, in distinction to somebody else's argument, to someone else in the conversation. And this is not a slight against Richard Hayes, right? He's not saying Richard Hayes is stupid. He just says, I disagree with his interpretation. And here's my interpretation, right? And here's the warrant, my evidence for why I disagree with that interpretation. And here's the new interpretation I'm offering, right? The same thing we did with the text last week with that sample text, right? Jesus saying, you have heard it said, but I am saying, blank, 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 right? My interpretation is X, Y, and Z. Again, this matters though when there's something that you get the space to, interpret. When you're thinking about a history of Christianity paper, so much of that is not really up for interpretation. Some of it is, but so much of it is still just what happened. Hebrew Bible, a lot of interpretation. The exam question, I know a lot of people were coming to me last time about the conquest of Joshua, right? That is an interpretive question, right? I think that this means blank. I think that this type of interpretation leads to these implications, right? It can be very first person because you are the one making the argument, and you are the one who has to evaluate the strength of that argument for your readers so they can be convinced. And then you want them to know it was your argument, right? When they are returning to it, it's not somebody said, no, Terry said, this is a way to interpret it, right? This was Terry's argument. So you do kind of want to attach yourself to it. Topic sentences, final thing, not only introduce whatever we're going, they're not only signposts, they connect, right? So just like with a GPS, we don't get to just a random street without having first ridden on the previous ones to get there. They all connect us to the final destination. And the same has to be true for topic sentences. None of them should be out of the blue. None of them should be in any way disconnected. They need to be able to follow the same logical flow, whatever flow we are making. And they need to build upon each other toward our final conclusion. For instance, 2 more slides and then we're done. The passage that proves this case is blank. I submit that it is whatever, right? So we have a topic sentence introducing a new verse, but that's building upon the previous thing. The passage that proves this case, right? So he's made a case, now he's drawing evidence to build upon it. We get it again here. The key to my understanding of this passage is the last verse, right? So he's even zoning in even further, connecting it to what he just said, but zoning in on the last verse, and then giving us a reason, almost precisely because it is so understated in its form. So they build upon each other, even if it's in a new paragraph, even if it's in a new section, right? We're saying, what did I establish in the previous section? Now I'm taking that kind of as my basis, and I'm building another argument on top of it, building something else. And that's why it's important for us to revise to make sure that we put those in the right order. Because if we're trying to make an argument in the 3rd section that we're bringing out of nowhere and has no foundation for yet, then we might need to do some other work in sections 1 and 2 to make sure that there's something solid that we can rest it on. I don't think, well, I think the idea is that if you have, well, I think there should only still be one claim, right? But the subsections of how you make it, I don't think it necessarily has to do in terms of strength, but in terms of, yeah, and in terms of flow, right? What is required to say, what is the basis that I need in order to make this other claim, right? What groundwork do I need to build to make sure my reader understands this thing? So then I can, this is what he's saying, right? In this previous one, I'm making a case, but the passage that proves this is blank. He is relying upon this passage because he has to establish groundwork. So then he can say, and then my key to understanding this passage is the last verse. But he can't just drop into the last verse without first explaining the whole passage and giving its context, right? So I think it's not about importance, because in what he's really keying in on is the very end of the last verse. He has to still set up, though, the context. So he's not just citing something out of Romans out of the blue. So I think it all has to do with, I guess I want to say the word sequence, What is the sequence of events, or what's the sequence of our argument? That's going to help the reader most get it. I think that's what's most important. And we might all do that differently. But at the end of the day, the point that we hope is that the reader gets the argument in whatever flow that is. Do you have any other questions? Well, that is all I have for today. We're right on time, 9:32. If you do have questions, of course, feel free to reach out either to me or to the Writing Center. I'm double checking really quickly. Yes, but I want to say that it's 2 weeks from now. I think it's how I scheduled that, but let me see. Yes, so there's one more on November 30th. So we're not meeting next Tuesday just because Thanksgiving. Even though people will still have class on Tuesday, people will be traveling and it will be too much. So our last one will be November 30th, and that one will be preparing for final exams and beyond. So that one will also kind of think about how to sustain some of these practices through the rest of seminary. Since this course, these series of workshops are only for this first semester. So yeah, November 30th. Great. Be well. Have a great rest of your day.